Automation is supposedly making our lives easier, from the self-driving car and vacuuming robots to wearable computers and algorithms that sculpt our online experience. But has it made our lives better? Let's ask Nicholas Carr. He is the author of The Glass Cage, Automation and Us. And Nicholas joins us on the line now from Denver, Colorado. And it's good to have you back on the program, Nicholas. We had you here last time for The Shallows when you looked at how the internet is changing the way we think. The new book, why'd you decide to write this one?
Well, while I was writing The Shallows, I started to come across another area of research that indicated that as software becomes more sophisticated and we become more dependent on using our computers to do things, whether in our professional lives or our personal lives, we tend to become less capable of doing those things ourselves. And so in some ways, this both continues and expands on the discussion in The Shallows by broadening it out to look at the implications of computers and software in general on how we behave, how we learn, the talents we develop or don't develop.
I think we all understand the expression of living in a gilded cage, but what's the glass cage?
It's the title draws on, is a play on the phrase, the glass cockpit, which is how pilots today refer to the flight decks that they fly in. And for decades now, pilots have been transferring parts of their jobs to computers and to flight automation systems, to autopilots. And so more and more they fly in what they call a glass cockpit, which means they're flying not by looking out at the world, but by looking into computer screens that surround them in the cockpit. And it struck me that this is a good metaphor for how all of us today are starting to live. We do more and more things, we live more and more of our lives by looking into the glass screens of computers and smartphones and so forth. And these glass cockpits, what aviation tells us, and I think what our own experience tells us, can very easily become glass cages that cut us off from the world and from some of the deeper satisfactions of being in the world and acting in the world.
Well, apparently you're not the only person who's concerned about that, because I gather a year or more ago, the American Federal Aviation Administration put out a memo telling pilots, actually to encourage them to promote manual flying operations when appropriate. Why did they feel they needed to put that admonition out there?
That's right. In 2013, the FAA here in the United States sent out what they called a safety alert to all airlines, encouraging them to get their pilots to practice manual flying more often. And the reason they felt compelled to put that out is because they had been doing research, the agency had been doing research that showed that there was an increasing incidence of pilots making mistakes when they had to take over manual control of the plane. Today, you know, in the typical flight today, passenger flight today, the pilot controls the plane for only about 3 minutes, a minute and a half on takeoff and a minute and a half on landing. And yet there are all sorts of scenarios where the pilot has to come back in and take over control. And if they make mistakes because their skills have become rusty, that raises the odds of having a serious accident. And so I think in the aviation area, we see both the good side and the bad side of computer automation, because through most of the history of flight automation, we've seen improvements in safety, very great improvements in safety, but more recently, we seem to have hit a turning point where we've given so much control, so much responsibility to the computer instead of the pilot, that the pilots begin to lose their own skills. And when they're called upon to take control, they make sometimes catastrophic errors. And the FAA is concerned enough that they're trying to back away at least a bit from automation and give a little more control to the human pilot.
Do you think the pilots themselves are aware of the fact that their skills may be fading?
They are. If you look at surveys of pilots that have been done on this topic, anywhere from 70 to 90% say that they are concerned about the loss of skill, the deadening of skill that comes with a loss of practice. If you're not flying the plane manually very often, then you aren't practicing those skills. You're not keeping yourself sharp. And so even though pilots, praise a lot of aspects of automation, they are very concerned about this slow but steady deterioration of their own manual hands-on flying skills.
Let's use another example here. There's been tons of discussion lately in the media and on social media about self-driving cars. I guess it's probably almost 5 years ago now that Google announced it was developing a self-driving car. Why do you think that was such a significant moment in terms of our understanding what computers can and cannot do?
The big change in automation has been around for a long time. We've been handing over chores to machines and computers for a long time. But now computers are able to take over jobs, take over activities that until recently we thought were protected as human skills and human activities. And the Google self-driving car really underscored that kind of change. For a long time, psychologists have drawn a distinction between what they call tacit skills and explicit skills. And explicit skills are kind of what you can write down as a set of instructions. So how to bake a cake. Whereas tacit skills are ones that we do kind of intuitively. And that distinction has been a distinction that it has also been a way we explain what computers can be good at and what they can't be good at. If you can write down a list of instructions, then you can program a computer to do that. But if you can't, if it's a kind of intuitive skill, we've assumed that computers and robots wouldn't be able to take that over. But what the Google car, the self-driving car, shows us is that even something as complex as taking, say, a left turn in traffic, which you couldn't write down how exactly you do that. It comes from human experience, human skill, human perception. Yet today, computers are able to do that, to replicate that skill. They're not thinking the way we think, but they're able to replicate these very subtle, very difficult talents. And that's true of flying planes and driving cars. It's also true of doing analyses, making judgments, making decisions. All these areas that we thought were the special purview of we human beings are now being taken over, or at least some aspects, by computers.
Well, let's try another one here. If there's anybody out there who says automation is fine for flying and fine for driving, but it's certainly not going to affect me, I work in healthcare where you still need hands-on individual judgment. Are they right, or is there automation coming to healthcare as well?
They're both right and wrong. I mean, I would agree that you still need individual judgment, but what we're seeing is pressure throughout the healthcare field, the medicine field, as in law, in other areas. We're seeing pressure to transfer analytical and judgment-making responsibility to computers. So once you introduce, for instance, an electronic medical record system into a primary care physician's practice, you also begin to automate the carrying out of patient exams, the diagnoses skill. Suddenly the doctor finds himself or herself following the software, following a computer template. And often, I think the evidence is appearing that we're getting the balance wrong, that by taking away responsibility from the experienced, talented doctor and giving it to a computer program, we're also putting the doctor in a position where their own skills do begin to erode, just as we see with pilots. And I think over the long term, what that means is less attentive, less personalized, less humane medical care as computers take more responsibility.
Let's do one more, Nicholas. How about how advances in computer software or automation help architects design buildings? Any changes there to tell us about?
Yes, the story in architecture shows how even skills that we think of as creative, artistic, aesthetic skills are being turned over to computers as well. So architects now can use computers essentially to design buildings and design all the elements and details of buildings. They can, you input the parameters, the basic dimensions and so forth of a building you're trying to build into a computer, and the computer outputs essentially a finished model showing, where all the insulation goes, where the windows go, where the bricks or tile goes. And here too, there's both good and bad. I mean, architects can design shapes and textures that were simply impossible to do by hand. But also, a lot of architects, particularly veteran, experienced architects, suggest that there's a loss of creativity and a loss of ingenuity and a kind of loss of human feel to buildings when they're generated largely by software, rather than evolving from talented artists and architects drawing sketches and building models by hand. So here too we see, as we transfer responsibility to computers, we see a subtle loss of what I think are the most valuable talents that experienced, skilled human beings can bring to these kind of jobs.
Okay, so we've done 4 examples of so-called glass cage automation potentially negative impacts here: flight, auto, health, and architecture. And I can imagine people watching this saying, look, at the toothpaste out of the tube. We're not going to go back to a day where computers didn't help us with all of these things. The arrow is pointing inexorably in one direction. A, do you believe that? And B, if you do, is it too late to do anything about it?
I do believe that the arrow is pointing in one direction, which is this viewpoint that is sometimes called technology-centered automation, which instead of saying, what are human beings good at, the designers and even the users of technology start by saying, what are computers good at? And therefore, what can we hand over to computers? And everything we can possibly hand over to computers or robots, let's do that. And then whatever's left over, that'll be what the human being does. And the flaw in that logic is that human beings end up taking on passive roles. They become observers. They become locked in a glass cage where they're looking at computer monitors. They're reading data outputs. They're being essentially data entry clerks. And we're not very good at that. And that steals from us, I think, the highest forms of human talent, which computers and robots can't replicate. And I'd point to conceptual thinking, critical thinking, creative thinking. Those are things that don't come to us when we take this technology-centered viewpoint. Having said that, I do think that there is an alternative, and a lot of experts in automation, the people who study computer-human interactions, point to this, and it's what they call human-centered automation, where you do begin by thinking about what are the distinctive skills of people, and how can we design the software, how can we design the computer systems to get the most out of us, and while also getting a lot of the benefits that computers can give us by, they're absolutely invaluable when it comes to providing new information, alerting us to cases where we might be doing something wrong, offsetting our own human flaws and biases. There is a possibility of creating more balanced systems where human beings get to exercise their fullest talents and enjoy the satisfactions that come from that, and we also get the benefits of computers. We haven't gone on that path so far, but I think it is possible to switch.
Is anybody leading the way in terms of human-centered automation?
The short answer, unfortunately, again, is no. There are large incentives for taking the technology-centered approach. Because you tend to get the optimum productivity, at least in the immediate term, and the optimum efficiency by taking the human out of the picture, because computers are faster than us in many cases. So we sacrifice the long-term richness of our own talents in order to grab the short-term efficiency gains. But there are some positive indications. For instance, last year, Toyota Motor Company, announced that it was starting to replace some of the robots in its Japanese factories with human beings, with human craftspeople, who could, for instance, make crankshafts by hand. And the reason it's doing that is because it's found that the quality of work in its factories, something Toyota has always prided itself on, has tended to go down as it's become more and more dependent on robots. Robots aren't able to criticize themselves, to think holistically or conceptually about what they're doing. And I think Toyota has realized that by bringing human expertise and human craftsmanship back into the picture, it can both get a lot of the efficiency gains from computers and robots, but still maintain those human skills that in the long run assure the highest quality and also assure constant progress in manufacturing techniques. So it may be that we'll go too far in becoming dependent on computers, but then maybe the pendulum will begin to swing back when we begin to realize what we've lost.
So maybe, if I can rip off the line from Star Trek that I think you've got in your book as well, maybe resistance isn't futile. We understand what we're losing, and the requirement to keep that human touch is still there?
I hope so. I mean, this kind of triumphalist sense that computers are taking over and we should just sit back passively and let them do all the hard work and take on all the challenges has become kind of central to the Silicon Valley ideology, and I think it's kind of seeped into the general culture as well. We're very afraid to take on that sense that computers are better than us in some fundamental way, and if you do that, you're labeled a nostalgist or a Luddite or some other insult. But I do think that this isn't only about protecting our talents and protecting our responsibility and our role. It's also about protecting what gives us the deepest sense of satisfaction and fulfillment in our lives, which is struggling with hard problems and developing the rich talents needed to overcome those problems and overcome those challenges. And that really is what gives us satisfaction. And yet, what we look to software to do today, in our personal lives as well as in our jobs, is to make those challenges easier, to take over the hard effort and the hard work. And that ultimately takes a lot of the satisfaction, a lot of the fulfillment out of our lives. So this is not just about how we work, it's really about how we live, and kind of the meaning, to push it a little further, the meaning of human being. What does it mean to be human beings in the world?
Nicholas, just before we go, there is an option that anybody who has worked in an office has always considered. We're going to roll a clip of that, and then we'll come back and chat. Let's roll it, please.
Back up in your bed with the resurrection. Is the group harder than any eruption that shows no affection? They want to ban us on Capitol Hill, cause it's die, motherfuckers, die, motherfuckers. All along it was a ghetto, nothing but the ghetto.
Well, you can't see it, but you know what's going on there. The three guys are having their way with an office printer because it's just destroyed their confidence for the last time. Short of taking a baseball bat to all of this stuff, have you got some better advice for us on how to fight back against this?
Well, certainly taking a baseball bat to your smartphone or something would be a literal way to break out of the glass cage. But I think by shifting our attitudes about tools and technologies, particularly computerized ones, we can shift the way we use them and become kind of more, wiser in the way we use them. And what I would suggest is that we need to stop looking at technology purely as a means of production or a means of consumption, which is how we tend to look at it, and look at it instead as a means of experience, that the way we use tools shapes our experience of life. And as soon as you begin to think of your smartphone or Facebook or whatever as shaping your experience of life, you can begin to ask hard questions about whether the way you're using it and the way these services and gadgets are designed are really enriching your life in making you feel more fulfilled and more satisfied, or whether in the end they're impoverishing your life and really are becoming this cage that separates you from the richness of experience that comes with mastering hard skills, interacting with people face to face, interacting with the world directly rather than through this screen.
That's Nicholas Carr, author of The Glass Cage, not to be confused with Nicolas Cage, author of The Glass Car. It's really good of you to be on TVO with us again tonight, Nicholas. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.